Chapter 27. A Difficult Crossing. I Cannot Control These Feelings. For all the years Dan and Gustavo had spent near beaches and oceans, neither of them had ever crossed the unpredictable waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The vessel they were about to board was a comfortable steamship, one of the first to emerge out of the sailing era into the steam engines of the early 1900s. The cabins and staterooms were clean, well appointed, for the most part, and the service seemed adequate. The restaurants were still huge refectories, not the sort of dining facilities one encounters aboard vessels of the 21st century. "Would you look at this?" Bianca exclaimed when she and Generoso entered their stateroom. "Every piece of furniture is encased into the walls or fastened to the floor. Do you think that means that we will encounter storms and heavy swells?" Generoso smiled. "I don't think so, dear. I simply think that no one wants to be trampled by a wayward wardrobe in the middle of the night." Bianca exploded in joyous laughter. "I can only imagine. You're too funny, Generoso. You should talk to my mother. She's already locked in their suite with Dad. To be sure, she's finding the crossing absolutely nightmarish." "I certainly can understand how she must feel, Bianca. For someone who is as fearful of water as your mother is, it would be very difficult to enjoy 7 days in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean." "Yes, I know," Bianca replied, as she began unpacking her sea trunk. "But if she would only try to enjoy the fresh air, the sunsets, which are magnificent at this time of year, I'm sure she could get used to this sort of travels." "As long as you don't become as fearful as she is, I'm fine with that," Generoso added, taking his wife in his arms and kissing her feverishly. "Wow, what's got into you?" Bianca demanded, tittering and pulling away from him. "Have you been starving for love and affection?" "No, not starving really, but I am just impatient. I am sorry, I must sound like a lustful individual." He wrapped his arms around her waist. "I'm just a man in love with his wife, that's all." Meanwhile, in Damianos and Gustavo's cabin, the two men were putting their belongings in the closets in silence until Gustavo asked, "Do you think we will have a place of our own in Rio Archer?" "I do believe so, yes, Gustavo," Damianos replied. "I am not yet aware of the actual precise arrangements, but I am sure the couple will live alone in their newer residence." "I'm only asking because I, for one, would feel awkward living in the same house as my friend and his wife. It's not me. It's not the kind of thing I would do." "And what would you like to do? I mean, as a job, what sort of job do you think you could handle? And don't rush to answer, please, because you need to think that we're living in a century and in a country which does not offer all of the facilities of the 21st century. Yes, I am reminded of it practically every time I turn around. There are still shoemakers, cobblers, steam train engineers, station masters, bricklayers, and all of the professions that seem to disappear one after the other in our future. As for which job I would like to do when we get to Rio Archer, I will have to think. I'll think about it while we're crossing the Atlantic. But I can already tell you that it will have to do with driving a vehicle." Damianos grinned. "Ah, yes, but there aren't any long-haul trucks like semis in Colombia yet. Your skills as a driver will surely be in demand." In their stateroom, Regina and Giorgio were relaxing after their steward had taken care of storing their belongings in the closets and dressers. Regina was trying to read a book she had bought at one of her favourite London libraries, while Giorgio was deeply absorbed in reading his newspaper. "I will never understand how you can be so calm in circumstances like these," she said, dropping the book on the small table separating their two chairs. "Doesn't it bother you that we might lose our lives in the next 7 days?" "Regina, I believe we've had this conversation the last time we boarded a ship. In fact, we've had similar discussions every time before that too. The only difference is that today we are travelling aboard a steamship. This vessel has been built to withstand the storms and ocean swells that other sailing boats could not manage in the past. Therefore, dearest, there is even less to worry about than there was a year or 30 years ago when you first made the crossing with your own parents." After an evening departure, the ship frayed itself a passage through the dark waters of the Atlantic, while the family enjoyed a meal at the restaurant. It was far from being fine cuisine. Today's menu offered an appetizer of ham and coleslaw with bread and butter. The main course was comprised of diced beef cooked in a dubious-looking sauce with green beans served over white rice. "That looks awful," Bianca said with a trace of disgust in her voice. "Maybe I'll have the rice and just some beans. That meat looks like it's been macerated in engine oil." "Good grief, Bianca," Regina said, looking down at her own plate with a grimace look coming across her face. He would just put anyone out of appetite with such remarks. I'm sorry, Mother, but I really can't describe this dish in any other way. It looks simply terrible. Maybe we could have some ketchup, Gustavo blurted before he realized that no one except Dan and Damianos would know what he was talking about. I mean, if only we could catch our own fish, we could cook wonderful meals. You can cook, then? Regina asked the big man. Maybe you'll be able to demonstrate your culinary savvy when we get home, if we ever get there. Oh, Mother, please don't start, Bianca admonished. You know very well that we're going to be fine. I'm sorry, but I couldn't help overhearing your remarks, Signor. A young fellow sitting on the other side of Giorgio and opposite Bianca said, I think we will be indeed fine, although I will exhale a sigh of relief when we reach Boston. Crossing the Atlantic is never easy at any time of the year, but during the equinox like now, it's even more treacherous. He paused and fixed his gaze on Giorgio. I'm sorry, but let me introduce myself. The name is Antonio Gregorio. I'm on my way to Rio Archer. How about you? It's nice meeting a compatriot, Giorgio replied. The name is Gomez, Giorgio Gomez. Once the introductions were over, Damianos asked, Did you say you were in transport, Signor Gregorio? What sort of transport is that, if I may ask? Coffee, Signor Damianos. I transport beans to the various terrefaction stations between Bocaata and Rio Archer. It's a seasonal type of work, but we're pretty busy during the picking season. Damianos turned his head to Gustavo. I think you might call this meeting serendipitous, wouldn't you? Gustavo nodded and smiled. Indeed, Uncle Damianos. He turned his gaze to the transporter. I think what our uncle means is that I will be seeking employment in the transport industry as soon as we reach Rio Archer. If you wouldn't mind accepting a letter of application, I would be glad. No need, my dear fellow, no need for the paperwork, which I absolutely detest, Antonio replied. It's the driving that will give me comfort. If you can drive, I can employ your services. So when we get back, I'll put you through a road test of mine, and we'll see how you do. How's that? Perfect, Gustavo replied, visibly happy about this unexpected development. But tell me something, Generoso said. Isn't it a fact that most plantations have their own terrefaction plants? And if I recall correctly, many of the workers bag and transport their own beans to the plants. Yes, that is still the case, Signor Ricciulli. However, with the advent of motorization, many plantation owners have gathered their terrefaction vats under one roof. More efficient way of doing things, I'd say. That night, the westerly picked up speed and intensity so that the vessels had to navigate through quite an imposing swell for several hours. Although it didn't seem to affect many passengers, who were mostly asleep by then, Regina was sitting upright in her chair, her arms wrapped around her pillow. I can't take this, Giorgio. I surely can't bear it. Being used to these outbursts while at sea, Giorgio only grumbled. It's all right, dear. It will pass. Just come back to bed. I just can't move, Giorgio. We will die, I'm sure of it. Knowing that his wife would not stop her ranting until he dragged her back to bed, Giorgio got up and went to sit beside her for a few minutes, until he convinced her to slip back under the covers with him. In their cabin, Damianos and Gustavo could not sleep either. Damianos was not easily perturbed, but as a cat in the middle of a swollen ocean with fierce winds fronting the vessel, he didn't feel at all secure. Truly, Damianos, there's nothing to fear. This is not God's desire to see us sink at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Trust in God, for goodness sake, man. That's just it, Gustavo. I'm not really a man, am I? My feline instinct tells me there's peril around me and I can't control these feelings. Well then, why don't you curl up at the foot of my bed and I promise to take care of you if anything should happen? Upon hearing these words, Damianos burst out laughing. I truly can't imagine you taking care of me, Gustavo, but thanks. I appreciate the sentiment all the same. Only God himself will take care of me. That was exactly my point, Damianos. Didn't you hear me say that you should trust in God? All right. It's foolish of me, I know. Not foolish at all, in my view. There are certain things you can easily control or squash. Yours, you've got to move with them, I think. Okay, why don't you go back to sleep and I'll find something to do in the meantime. Right, as long as you don't disappear, okay? If I do, I'll be back. I know I won't be able to stop you, but just don't be too long, okay? Gustavo said, turning to the side and punching his pillow into submission. A few minutes later, he was asleep and Damianos was alone. He was impatient, as ever to be in Boston. Somehow he had never been there. Upon landing in the park near the university, Damianos realized that the sun hadn't set yet on this side of the Atlantic. He looked around him and began walking through the autumn leaves at his feet. He really had no goal in mind. He just didn't like being aboard that huge vessel. He had absolutely no control over it. It bothered him. When he had been travelling along the Florida coast with Dan's wife and their children, it was aboard a cabin cruiser. He felt comfortable at the helm of that yacht. He knew God was near all the time, but right now it seemed as if too many events were left out of his hands. The family, the Ricciulli, was going to put down stakes in Colombia, and then there would be children, many children in fact. He would be Uncle Damianos for many years to come, he supposed. A tinge of ruefulness marred his gentle voice when he said, "I can't let them live in a rut like that." As the words escaped his mouth, Damianos truly thought he heard God's laughter somewhere over his shoulder. He smiled